Scott Hughes is here, political analyst Scott Hughes. Let us start with the four constitutional amendments on the ballot, one by one. Number one is the tax exemption. Explain to people what the outer shelf is and why goods that are shipped out of Louisiana to this outer shelf, there's that magic word again, why they should or should not be tax exempt. What's this one about?
Well, it's about several things. When you mention the outer shelf, the continental United States is the land that we live on, and then it extends out into the Gulf or the Atlantic or the water. And a country is only allowed to claim domain so far out into the water, then it becomes international water. And since we do a lot of deep well drilling in Louisiana, off the Texas, different places, there are rigs out not on the United States soil. They're out international soil. So if you are a major oil producing state, you have materials coming to you, basically being assembled to then go out on boats or helicopters, in some case food, etc., out to these rigs that fall under the Interstate Commerce Clause. You're not supposed to tax stuff just passing through your state.
But
that's a federal law.
been, evidently.
And so for years and years and years, these things would go into warehouses and they'd eventually go out on a boat. And so we would not tax them. Apparently what's been happening is tax assessors along the coast in Louisiana have said, wait a second, I should put a tax on that stuff in that warehouse just staying there to go out next month to the offshore. And so they started taxing. And a lot of questions came up, constitutional law questions on tax, federal tax law with the Interstate Commerce Clause. And so there's a lot of confusion over can you or can you not. Most people that look at this say you cannot tax that, but yet these assessors are. So rather than fight this in court for years and years and years, I think the legislature said, let's just put it in the Constitution and make it clear that these Louisiana assessors cannot put this inventory tax on things headed for the outer shelf, headed for international water commerce.
Inventory tax, I had referred to it as that because basically at the point of sale, it's already being taxed once. So this is like a second tax on it, right?
Correct. And this is the kind of tax that would be largely assessed as property, as personal property, like a car dealership holding an inventory. We're taxing it. And so the concern is if we continue to do that, let these assessors, local assessors, assess this tax, the concern was it makes us non-competitive with Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, other places that are following what we believe to be federal law and not taxing that.
Okay,
so this exemption, if passed, would just clarify that they cannot assess this tax on materials headed for offshore. This is not stuff to be used on the land.
Amendment 2 would add schools, the Baton Rouge schools predominantly, correct, to the Education Excellence Fund.
And
it would also provide some funds for public TV.
Yeah, Amendment 2 is to take money from what's called the Educational Excellence Fund. It's a trust fund that money goes into, that the interest is used every year. And the problem is that there were some schools that have been created today that were not in existence when this originally was put in place 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so I think you mentioned the TV Authority. There are a couple. There's a new school called Thrive Academy that's specifically mentioned in the legislation. And then there's what's called the Magnet Lab schools. I think there's one in Baton Rouge or maybe one at Grambling. There's a couple that have come into existence that weren't in the original legislation. So the legislature is really just saying the intent is to give money from this fund to these schools, Louisiana public schools, of which these are, and the TV Authority, which is basically public television in Louisiana. They provide services.
Why did they lump that in? Because I'd be okay with the school thing. I'm not okay with the public TV thing. You follow me?
Yes, and again, I can't answer for the legislature. I think why they did, like in my opinion, I think why they did it was that it's really public television. LPB does a lot of programming for the schools, and they're the video content provider for a lot of the schools that are used today. One thing I'll mention about this one, if you're interested, the Senate passed this amendment 37-0, and the House passed it 95-0. There was zero opposition to this bill in the legislature. This is viewed in their minds as a cleanup. Some would say, do we need this in the Constitution? But we already have in the Constitution every other school in Louisiana. So they viewed this as just tacking on 3 new schools and the TV.
What caught my eye was, it's all South Louisiana schools. So schools in this part of the state are included in the overall umbrella of previous legislation.
They're already in, yes. Most of the public schools are already in. And like I said, I think one of the lab schools is over at Grambling. I don't know the exact language in the bill, but it's the lab schools that got added. But yes, most of the public schools are already in this bill. This is just to add something that's already existing law.
Amendment 3 is the Board of Tax Appeals jurisdiction. I'm afraid about this board because the board's appointed by the governor.
Yeah, do we read that right?
correct?
It says it's part of the executive branch. What exactly does that mean? Who and does it rob somebody of their day in court? The idea is to streamline tax appeals, but at what cost?
Well, this one's interesting. You already have a body in Louisiana called the Board of Tax Appeals. It is like every other board or commission. It is largely appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate. So this is like every other board in the state. They already deal with tax appeals. You can already go there if you have an issue on a tax appeal. What this amendment addresses is sometimes a tax appeal deals with a constitutional issue of law. Like we talked about a second ago on Amendment 1. The constitutional issue of law is that interstate commerce. Okay. And so that's something that a normal regulatory body can't deal with because you want to challenge constitutional law. So you have to go to court, the federal court system or the local court system. And so what Amendment 3 is saying is in these instances where you have a tax appeal that also deals with a potential constitutional law question, let's allow that to go to this existing Board of Tax Appeals. To be on the Board of Tax Appeals, you are a tax attorney. You study this very, very well. The belief is rather than require someone who has a tax appeal to go into court, maybe even federal court, where you could spend years and lots of money fighting on a tax appeal. Let's go over here and get a quick opinion of the tax board. My understanding is you probably still have your right to go into court if you don't like that.
That was my question, or is it kind of like going on Judge Judy, where if you let Judge Judy decide, you promise I'll never take this to court?
And again, I'm not a constitutional attorney. My understanding is this is putting a step in that hopes to resolve that issue. I will say, and this is a pretty important thing to know on this bill, the Senate voted 37-0 and the House voted 95-0 in this bill. And there's a lot of attorneys on both sides of this issue in the Senate and the House, and they saw this as an improvement to the current system, primarily because I think it will not require a taxpayer to have to go through a heavily onerous process into court. You can go to this commission, this tax board, and get a quicker answer.